This is likely going to be the most stupid video I make, and I've made some pretty stupid videos. We're going to trace the development of Dwarf Fortress's economics from state capitalism to communism. Dwarf Fortress has come a long way over the years, with many interesting new features being added as of late, like taverns and adventurers, vampires, and so on. However, it's also had some pretty major features removed, and with good reason. Perhaps one of the biggest was the in-fort economy, or the player economy as it's also called. It was a feature back in the 40D version of Dwarf Fortress, the one I started playing, which was replaced by later versions. So I'll be relying mostly on wiki articles and decade-old posts on forums. That's not to say you can't download it and try it yourself. I can, you can. Dwarf Fortress has come a long way though, so going that far back would physically hurt me. Also have to finish this video by release day. Back in 40D, your dwarves earned a wage in the form of money from their job, with which they purchased goods and paid rent. You could even mint currency, though no inflation was modeled as far as I can tell. So why was this feature removed, and why do major Dwarf Fortress updates only drop roughly every 5 years? Is it because Ton Adams is making this incredible, ambitious game all on his own and it takes a lot of work, or is it something more sinister lurking underneath the surface? The economy system was actually removed because it went horribly wrong. And like everything that goes horribly wrong in Dwarf Fortress, it went wrong in very funny and very interesting ways. Here's roughly how the system worked. When the parasitic noble class eventually decided to move to your fort due to your accumulation of wealth, they would inaugurate the economy. You were able to prevent the inevitable march of history by editing a .ini file to say economy no. In the American localization, this is called a student loan. If you didn't halt the organization of your fort into the two opposing classes of the bourgeois and working class, then suddenly all your dwarves have bank accounts. And they start with a prepaid stimulus check of 200 dwarf bucks. They earned wages paid by the fort itself, since there's no actual employers beyond the fort itself. They then spent these wages on rent for their living accommodation, food and drink for subsistence, and pets. This is sort of like the dwarven Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Whatever is left after paying the cost of living is then spent at shops. They gravitated towards buying things they either need, like socks, or things that they like due to their unique personality trait, like socks. If a dwarf can't afford to rent their room, they get evicted and have to find a new place to sleep that they can afford. If they can't afford one, well, it's the barracks or the floor for them. This means you had to make sure to provide low-income housing so that your young dwarves could afford their first home instead of becoming homeless or having 18 roommates. It also meant that dwarves who fell on hard times wouldn't have to become homeless. A very sensible and easily accomplished policy in a world where developers aren't price fixing and housing isn't viewed as an investment that must always increase in value to the point of being unsustainable. Your more impressive bedrooms will be rented by the richer dwarves. Congratulations, you created a class system for no discernible reason. I hope you're proud of yourself. The state functionaries, the apparatchiks or nobles as the game calls them, are assigned quarters by you, the player. If you don't like the idea of leaving housing security to the whims of the market, you can edit the .ini file so that rent is always zero. That way you can create vast homogeneous apartment complexes with decent units for all of your dwarves. Now, here's where it gets really funny. Unlike a home, which you can survive without for a time, albeit with lifelong trauma and devastating impairment to your upward social mobility that could trap you into permanent homelessness, hunger is non-negotiable. Everyone needs to eat. Without it, you die. While the commoditization of housing is a bad idea due to the inherent need for shelter and security, making food a commodity is a really bad idea. As a dwarf, like a human, can't survive without food, they will do anything to eat. Dwarf Fortress doesn't model theft, but had it done so, you bet your ass these dwarves would be getting their skulls crushed by the state-appointed hammerer dwarf for stealing a loaf of bread. Instead of becoming a thief, however, you have a much worse alternative. They can go into debt. Meaning they can no longer afford anything, like rent, goods, and so on. And if food prices remain outside of their income range, which they tend to do because the food prices are fixed, and their income range has decreased because of a lack of a job usually, or a lack of ability to do their job, then they continue to accrue debt endlessly, trapping them into permanent homelessness, and making upward social mobility impossible. And since going into debt automatically evicts you, even if you live in zero-rent Soviet apartment blocks, you still get evicted. So your homeless dwarf is likely grumpy and depressed, probably not in a good enough mood to do good work, or they're having constant tantrums interrupting their ability to work, which then puts them further into debt. Not only do dwarves need to work to make ends meet, they also like to work. So if there's no work to be done, that makes them upset. And if there's no work to be done, they don't make money. And if they don't make money, as we've gone over in gross detail, they become even more upset. With the arrival of the nobility and the inauguration of dwarven state capitalism, the dwarves recognized the inevitable class struggle and so spontaneously organized into unions. I'm not making any of this up. These are called guilds. There were 6 guilds in the 40D version of the game. The Miners Guild, the Carpenters Guild, the Masons Guild, the Metalsmiths Guild, the Jewelers Guild, and the Craftsdwarves Guild. Each season, the guilds petitioned the manager, the player-appointed Minister of Labor, for wage increases or jobs mandates, if there's a lack of jobs. Every season, the manager meets the request of 3 of these 6 unions. He obviously can't meet all their demands, because that would give them the silly idea that nothing gets produced without them and that they hold all the power in society. This could put the manager and the rest of the nobles in a very awkward position. So, to solve the lack of work, the manager asks the executive dwarf, in this case it would be a noble, to mandate a number of jobs in order to address the jobs crisis. If the jobs aren't done, however, that's a crime, and as a result, random dwarves who had skills to do with those jobs will fall victim to summary punishment from the state-appointed hammerer. In order to prevent a jobs crisis and to keep unemployment low, players would frequently embark on great public works projects or create functionally useless jobs like a room full of levers for dwarves to flick up and down endlessly to give them a sense of purpose and a way to make money. This was called the Dwarven Casino because it resembles a room full of depressed pensioners pulling slot machines that then dispense pennies. So, since dwarves can only make money in exchange for their labor, you have to make fake jobs, which of course is a lot more rational than just providing for the basic cost of living for all of your dwarves, no questions asked. We're not communists after all. That would only happen in around 2010. When the working class of the fort becomes too rich, the tax collector that arrived with your baron will extract these riches in the form of taxes, which are normally meant to go to the ruling class, aka the nobles, which the tax collector is a part of. Though I'm not sure if that functionality was actually ever implemented into the game. I think the money just kinda disappears. Unlike in real life where it goes to the defense budget. It's all based on credit anyhow. And probably the funniest part of the entire system is that dwarven children don't have their own checking accounts, so they live off of the wealth of their parents, which as I mentioned can be negative. Which means that if a child is born to rich parents, that child will actually start to accumulate wealth from the moment they are born, whereas the poor child will start to accumulate debt from the moment they are born. The game actually kinda modeled generational wealth inequality, which is kind of intense. There's no inheritance though, from what I can tell, so while the income brackets affect your prospect of upward social mobility in structural ways, you won't have rich dynasties accumulating wealth over the course of generations. The fact that children have access to both their parents' accounts though before they become adults means that they can accumulate things of value which I believe are still considered their property, which can be liquidated once they get their own dwarven bank account. I might be wrong on the inheritance stuff, though it seems like people on the forums use the word inheritance interchangeably with the idea that the children utilize a combined wealth of both their parents. I saw some complained that children should only receive their parents' wealth upon the death of their parents, which actually would make the system a little bit less deep because it no longer factors in the wealth of the parents in determining the child's prospects of upward social mobility. That's a lot of words. I'm sorry. Anyways, here's where it gets fucking weird. I mentioned you can mint coins. However, this is a really bad idea. Since there's no employer-employee relations, a dwarf can't hire an accountant or something to handle their finances. They have to do it all themselves. This means they'll be running back and forth between the bank and the shops constantly as they buy and sell, which means they're spending less time working, which then also means they're spending less time earning money, which effectively torpedoes them from whatever income bracket they were in to the plump helmet mushrooms and water income bracket. The more coins you have, the more time you have to spend managing your coins, which means you have less time to actually make coins. It's incredibly stupid and incredibly funny. There are 2 ways to solve this issue practically in the game. 1, don't use cash, operate purely on credit. The other, don't let the dwarves handle the money, lock it up in a dwarven federal reserve. Another weird quirk is that legendary dwarves don't actually have to pay for anything. They also don't get paid for their work. They're so incredibly cool that people just give them what they want. However, their children aren't cool at all. They're babies, and babies use the accounts of their parents, and their parents don't care about money. This immediately traps the children of legendary level workers into infinite debt, since children don't earn an income. Similarly, the nobility, who also get whatever they want and are exempt from the economy, are also not earning any money, which means their children will also go into endless debt. Very cool. On top of all these systemic issues, the large amount of calculations, the shuffling of coins if you were dumb enough to open Pandora's box of currency minting and all that, caused massive performance issues in a game where you can already drain the ocean, and the game runs off of a single CPU thread, so you only have so much room to play with. The system also had a lot of interesting inherent contradictions as well. The means of production, meaning the workshops, was collectively owned by the working dwarves. Even so, they produced for a wage, instead of producing and selling their product, reaping the total value of their labor. The surplus value was extracted by the state as the products were placed in the fort stockpiles, which the dwarves could then purchase back using the wages they had earned producing the goods. A system that kinda makes no sense. It makes a little bit more sense if you conceptualize the workshops and all of the fort as being owned by the state, and the state being the capitalist. The nobles don't own the workshops, they're owned by the dwarves. They also don't own the stockpiles or the products, they're owned by the government of the fort, which means there's literally no reason for the nobles to hold power over the dwarves beyond the rules saying they have to. They don't own the workplaces, they don't pay the wages of the military or the hammer dwarf who enforces the laws of the fort. There is nothing that justifies nor secures their existence. Because of all of this, Dwarf Fortress is technically not fully capitalist, because it lacks capitalists. Anyway, this is all made extra funny because something to its effect was described by Friedrich Engels in this 1880 quote. The transformation either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. He goes on to say, state ownership of the productive forces is not the solution to the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. What Engels is saying here is that because of how broken the fundamentals of the systems are, it creates conditions that will lead to its replacement, like FPS death, homelessness, infinite baby debt, dwarf casinos on every corner. Because Engels died in 1895, he had no way of predicting the arrival of the mad genius Tarn Adams, and so could not have known of the existence of Dwarf Fortress, frames per second, baby debt, etc. However, he was also a very smart man, and so, had he known, we must assume he would have factored all of this into his analysis. Capitalism leads to FPS death, regardless of whether or not the workshops are owned by the fort, and so capitalism has to go. Following the update from 40D, it was replaced, with the economy system officially being put on hold in favor of a much simpler system of production for use instead of sale, of free housing and no money, and so Dwarf Fortress became communist. It's still got classes, sort of, so it's not a classless society in that it has a managerial upper class represented by the nobility, sort of like Soviet apparatchiks. But there's no distinction between all the other dwarves who are all workers. They produce according to their means and consume according to their needs. Let's call it socialism with dwarven characteristics. Tarn Adams has said the economy will be reintroduced into the game after an overhaul, which means we're likely to see it arrive somewhere in the 2050s. And that's fine, because it seems like people generally enjoy dwarven communism. It means less time spent stressing over economic inequality, sock monopolization, and so on, and more time spent drowning elves and flooding the surface of the world with magma. Either way, if he does re-add it, I'm sure he'll find a way to make it fun and interesting from a gameplay perspective. By the way, all this nonsense that I've been saying for the past, I don't know how many minutes, is why Dwarf Fortress is the best game ever made. So, the moral of Tarn's experiment with an economy simulation seems to be that a dwarf is entitled to the sweat of his beard. Thank you for watching, and thank you to the patrons.